Alright, that's good, man. I'm Logan. I'm going to show you step by step how to make lacto fermented hot sauce. So the ingredient list is really simple, right? 10 jalapenos, 1 green apple, 3 garlic cloves, teaspoon of cumin, fine sea salt, and filtered water.
If you're not able to use filtered water, you could buy a bottle of spring water at the store and that'll work perfectly fine. Do your best to stay away from tap water if you can. When it comes to salt, I like using fine sea salt because it dissolves the best in the water. And my suggestion is that you use salt that is not iodized, as it can give your ferment a weird flavor, and the only ingredient in it should be salt. No additives, no anti-caking agents, just salt. The prep work on this is incredibly easy. So first I grab the jalapenos after they've been thoroughly washed and dried, cut off the tops, and cut the peppers in half. I like to inspect the insides of the peppers to make sure nothing is going rotten and those seeds look nice and fresh. I normally don't remove seeds from fresh peppers, but you can if you find that they have a slight bitterness to them. After you cut all the jalapenos in half, go ahead and cut them into 1-inch pieces. You don't have to be super exact with this, just as long as they get cut. You just really need them to be able to fit into the jar nicely. I find that cutting the jalapenos up like this don't run the risk of having any kind of air pockets in the jar, and they break down nicely during the fermentation process also. Jalapenos and green apples pair extremely well together. So as far as the apple is concerned, after you get done washing it and air drying it, cut the tops off and cut around the core. There is definitely no need to cut the peel off of it, and you actually want the peel on there because that's where most of the lactobacillus is, on the apple itself. Now, as far as cutting the apples up into small pieces, I just like to cut them about the same size as I did the jalapenos, right? I almost always use fresh garlic in my fermented hot sauces, so this time I'm using 3 whole garlic cloves, giving them a light smash on the cutting board, remove that outer big layer. I do want to take a quick note that I like to save my kitchen scraps as they go in my compost. That, and I like to have 1 bowl for kitchen scraps. It helps keep your kitchen nice and clean and organized. That garlic clove has a root end that you want to nip off, and this is about it as far as prep work is concerned for our ferment. So the next step that we have is to actually getting to the fermentation process. So here's some of the equipment that you're gonna need if you're using my preferred method. You need a kitchen scale that weighs in grams, a mason jar, some sort of a fermentation weight, and recommended but not necessarily needed is a pH meter. I mean, we're working with food safety here, and I want to make sure that the fermentation process actually happens before we make our sauce and it is safe to consume. So first we grab our kitchen scale, set it to read grams, and now we want to place our mason jar on it, tare it, which means to zero the scale out, and then add our ingredients. That is the cumin seeds, the garlic cloves, the cut up pieces of apple, and the jalapenos. If you need to crush down some of the ingredients so that they all fit into the jar, remove the jar from the scale, and I'm using a rolling pin, but you could use some sort of a blunt object and lightly press down those ingredients to get a little bit more headspace in the jar. With the jar back on the scale, you want to fill the jar up with filtered water just to the bottom of the neck. You really just need enough water so when you place your fermentation weight in the jar, the ingredients stay submerged underneath that water level. So you might have to play around with how much water you put into the jar. Now you want to take note of this weight, 792 grams, and you want to multiply that by 2.5%. That is going to be the amount of fine sea salt that you need in order to make our brine. You can go anywhere between 2 to 5%, but I've found that 2.5% is definitely a sweet spot. So holding back those ingredients, pour that water into a mixing bowl. Place a small dish onto the scale, zero it out, and add that calculated amount of salt. I like doing it this way because if you add a little bit too much salt, you could always take pinches of it out until you get the amount that you want. Put your weighed out amount of salt into the water that we poured out from the mason jar and whisk it thoroughly to fully dissolve. This is why I like using fine sea salt, because it'll dissolve the best in the water. I like to put anything that I'm fermenting onto some sort of dish. This is just a glass pie dish. This is just to catch any kind of overspill that will occur. Now pour your brine into the jar that has the jalapenos, the cumin seeds, the apples, and the garlic. As I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that that brine level fills just to the bottom of the neck of the jar, and when you place your fermentation weight in there, all of your ingredients get completely covered with the brine. This is a very important step because you want to create what is called an anaerobic environment, and that is to inhibit any kind of bad bacterial growth in there. If any ingredients are allowed to touch air, then it will most likely mold and you'll have to scrap the project and start over. So the jar that's on the right has the fermentation weight all the way into the jar, and I use a coffee filter to cover it, and I use the ring from the mason jar lid to secure the filter. That is to keep any kind of bugs out of your ingredients. That white bubbly film that you're seeing is called communes. Perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable. I usually just skim it before I make the sauce. Now you want to let this ferment at room temperature. I have a place in my pantry that is away from direct sunlight and is consistent in temperature throughout any time of year, any time of day. How long you ferment is really a personal preference. I like to go 1 month on my ferments. You could definitely play around with the duration. After about day 3 or 4, you should see signs of fermentation process happening. It should look like lazy carbonation. That is just little tiny bubbles that'll collect either on top of the brine surface level or on the sides of the ingredients themselves. Before you make the sauce, remove your fermentation weight, and I normally skim off that yeast. Also, before making the sauce, I like to check the pH of the brine. I want to see something around 3.6, 3.7, definitely below that 4.6 threshold. Anything above that, you run the risk of growing bad bacteria and you'll need to start over. So the next step is we get to blend up the sauce. So strain out the brine from the jar and then add the solids into the blender. The brine is what we're going to be using to adjust the consistency on the sauce. Add just enough brine to cover the ingredients by 1/3. Turn on the blender on high and let it blend for about 30 seconds until it starts to get broken down and smooth. You'll be able to get a good gauge of how thick your sauce is at this point in time. If it's a little too thick, then go ahead and add some more brine while it's blending. Adding more brine will thin it out, and using less will yield a thicker sauce. I like smoother sauces, so I'm going to go ahead and strain my out. If you have a higher power blender like a Vitamix, you probably won't have to strain it out. This is just an optional step. Strain it through a fine mesh strainer. Use a ladle to gently force the sauce through the fine mesh strainer, and what is left behind is the pulp. So this pulp has a couple good uses. I like to dry it out and then grind it up, add it to some salt, and you get a homemade spicy seasoned salt, which is absolutely delicious. So the next step is cooking the sauce. This is definitely an optional step. You don't have to cook the sauce if you want to keep that lactic acid bacteria alive. I found that if you don't cook the sauce and let it keep fermenting, the flavor profile will change ever so slightly over time, where I like where the flavor is at. So once the sauce comes up to a gentle simmer, reduce the heat to medium-low and keep that lid on it. The lid's gonna help keep the fumes at bay. I love the color on the sauce and I love the consistency. Absolutely perfect. Now is the time that we get to finally taste the sauce. So give it a taste and see where it's at. Add more salt, add more pepper, but it really shouldn't need a damn thing. Once the sauce is cooled to room temperature, store it in whatever kind of container you want. I like using mason jars, and I do check the pH at this point in time, 3.3, which is perfect. As this sauce sits in the refrigerator, it will have a tendency to separate, being that we're not using Xanath gum or anything like that. So if it does separate, give it a shake before use. This will stay good in the refrigerator for a very long time. I've had batches of Lacto Fermented hot sauces for about a year and they're still going strong. Beautiful flavor, beautiful color. You're absolutely going to love this. And it is well worth the wait.